Stop for a few seconds and think about this. What if I told you that, in the United States of the 1970s, going to college was not a financial sentence that followed someone into middle age? What if I told you that studying was, in fact, a ladder, not an anchor tied to your ankle? Today, we are taught from an early age that education is the path. But almost no one talks about the real price of that path, or about who is actually paying the bill. The comparison between the United States of the 1970s and the United States today reveals something deeply uncomfortable. Higher education stopped being an accessible investment and became a mechanism of structural debt. In the 1970s, the dominant idea was simple: studying more meant earning more, living better, and moving up socially. And in most cases, that was true. Public universities were heavily subsidized by states. The average annual cost of a public university hovered around $400 to $600 per year. Even private universities cost only a fraction of what they do today. Adjusted for inflation, the numbers were still dramatically lower than current costs. More important than the absolute number was the relationship between cost and income. A student in the 1970s could pay a large portion of college expenses with a part-time job. Working during the summer in a factory, store, or office was often enough to cover a significant share of academic costs. The idea of graduating with massive debt simply was not part of the experience for most families. Today, the picture is completely different. The average annual cost of a public university easily exceeds $10,000, while private universities reach $40,000 or even $60,000 per year. And that doesn't include housing, food, books, administrative fees, and mandatory insurance. The result is a generation that begins adult life already owing the equivalent of the price of a house in the 1970s. In the 1970s, total student loan debt in the United States was practically irrelevant at a macroeconomic level. Today, it exceeds $1.7 trillion, larger than credit card debt and auto loans combined. We are not talking about exceptions, we are talking about an entire model built on debt. This debt completely reshapes the trajectory of adult life. In the 1970s, a newly graduated young person entered the job market thinking about buying a home, starting a family, investing, and saving. Today, graduates think first about financial survival. Student debt becomes a constant shadow. It defines where someone can live, which jobs they can accept, and even whether they can afford to take the risk of starting a business. Another crucial point is that, in the 1970s, a college degree was a powerful differentiator. It practically guaranteed access to stable jobs with salaries that grew over time. The financial return was clear, predictable, and relatively fast. Today, the degree has stopped being a differentiator and has become a minimum prerequisite, often without guaranteeing stability or good pay. This creates a cruel paradox: it has never been so expensive to study, and it has never been so uncertain whether the investment will pay off. Young people are encouraged to take on enormous debts under the implicit promise that it will be worth it, even when data shows that many degrees do not offer returns sufficient to justify their cost. In the 1970s, higher education was seen as a public good. States invested heavily because they understood that an educated population strengthened the economy as a whole. Today, education is treated as an individual product, where the risk is almost entirely transferred to the student. If it works out, the credit is yours. If it doesn't, the debt is yours too. This shift in responsibility is not accidental. It reflects a deep change in how society views the role of government, institutions, and the individual. The modern student is not just a learner, they are a debt-laden customer before they even graduate. The psychological impact of this is enormous. In the 1970s, making the wrong career choice did not mean carrying debt for decades. Today, choosing wrong can mean years of financial frustration, constant anxiety, and delaying major life decisions such as having children or buying a home. Student debt is not just financial, it is emotional, mental, and social. Another rarely discussed aspect is how this system affects inequality. In the 1970s, low-income students had real access to public higher education at low cost. Today, even with scholarships and aid, poorer students are the ones who take on the most debt, while wealthier students often pass through college debt-free or with family support. The result is that education, which should reduce inequality, often ends up amplifying it. When we compare these two eras, it becomes clear that something was lost along the way. The promise that studying always pays off didn't disappear, it just stopped being universal. For many, education has become a risky bet, made under social pressure, with consequences that last decades. The lingering question is not just why did it get so expensive, but who benefits from this model. Universities expanded, administrative structures grew, costs rose far above inflation, while starting salaries for many graduates stagnated. The burden almost always falls on the same group, young adults at the very beginning of their productive lives. They were not luxurious, but they fulfilled their core function, teaching literacy, basic critical thinking, and preparing students for the workforce or higher education. More importantly, the gap between a public school in a wealthy district and one in a poor district was smaller than it is today. Inequality existed, yes, but it did not so brutally determine a child's destiny. Attending a public school did not carry the same stigma it does today in many regions. As decades passed, something began to change structurally. The U.S. public school funding model, heavily based on local property taxes, started producing increasingly severe consequences. Districts with high property values collected more revenue, invested more, and offered better schools. Poor districts became trapped in a cycle of chronic underfunding. In the 1970s, this model was still partially offset by stronger state and federal investment, with greater efforts at equalization. Today, that balance has collapsed. Even with increased overall spending, distribution has become dramatically unequal. In some districts, annual spending per student exceeds $25,000 or $30,000. In others, especially rural areas or marginalized urban neighborhoods, it barely reaches half of that. This financial gap translates directly into the quality of the school experience. Well-funded schools offer modern libraries, science labs, access to technology, psychological counseling, and arts and sports programs. Underfunded schools struggle to retain teachers, update materials, and, in extreme cases, even maintain minimum physical conditions for learning. School infrastructure is a brutal portrait of this inequality. While some students learn in modern, climate-controlled, technologically equipped buildings, others attend schools with mold problems, inadequate heating, aging plumbing, and overcrowded classrooms. This is not the exception, it is reality for millions of students. In the 1970s, structural problems existed, but they were rarely so persistent and widespread. This inequality is not only material, it is pedagogical and emotional. Teachers in poor districts face larger classes, lower pay, less support, and greater pressure for results. This leads to high turnover, loss of accumulated experience, and constant instability. In the 1970s, the teaching profession still offered relatively more stability and less psychological burnout. Another crucial factor is access to technology. In the 1970s, everyone was on relatively equal footing, no one had personal computers or internet access. Today, technology could be a great equalizer, but it has instead become another dividing line. Students in wealthy schools have individual laptops, digital platforms, and classes in coding and robotics. Students in poor schools often rely on shared equipment or lack reliable internet access altogether. The consequence is direct. Academic performance increasingly reflects a student's zip code more than their individual potential. In the 1970s, a talented student from an average public school could still compete more evenly with peers from better schools. Today, that gap starts early and only widens over time. This inequality in basic education connects directly to the student debt problem discussed earlier. Students from underfunded public schools arrive at college less academically prepared, more insecure, and often with less access to career guidance. As a result, they are more likely to drop out, change majors, or take on debt without completing a degree, the worst possible outcome. Meanwhile, students from well-funded schools enter college with competitive advantages, stronger preparation, and often family financial support. The educational system, which should function as a social elevator, instead operates like a filter that separates those who already had advantages from those who didn't. In the 1970s, despite all its flaws, there was still a coherent narrative. Public schools prepared the average citizen for a functional life, and college expanded opportunities without financially destroying the student. Today, that narrative has fractured. Public schools no longer guarantee a uniform foundation, and universities charge prices many cannot afford without sacrificing decades of their lives. The result is a vicious cycle. Unequal public schools produce unequal preparation. That inequality pushes young people into universities without the necessary foundation. Universities charge high prices, pushing those same young people into debt. And when the return doesn't come, the blame falls entirely on the individual, never on the system. Perhaps the most provocative realization is that the problem did not begin at the university level. It began much earlier, when investment in basic education stopped being treated as a collective priority and became increasingly dependent on local wealth. Expensive higher education is merely the final stage of a process that began decades ago. Connecting these dots makes it impossible to ignore the central question. How can education remain a path to upward mobility when the starting line is already so unequal? Comparing the US of the 1970s with today is not about idealizing the past. It is about recognizing that, at some point, the country accepted as normal a system in which the quality of education, from kindergarten to college, depends more on neighborhood income than on student talent. And that silent choice carries a heavy price, not only financial, but social, economic, and human. This is not just a debate about schools. It is a debate about the kind of society that is built when education stops uniting and starts dividing from the very first day of class. If it is now clear that the path to college already begins unequally, starting with public schools funded at radically different levels, the next step in this logical chain deepens the problem even further: access to higher education and, above all, the real economic return of a degree. Because getting into college is not enough. The defining question for an entire generation is another one: is it worth it? In the United States of the 1970s, the answer was, in the vast majority of cases, yes. A college degree was a clear, powerful, and relatively rare differentiator. Only a smaller share of the population held higher education credentials, making the degree a true passport to better jobs, higher wages, and long-term stability. At that time, completing college meant almost automatic entry into the middle or even upper middle class. Companies competed for graduates. Career paths were common. There was a real expectation of continuous wage growth over time. The degree was not just a piece of paper, it was a concrete promise of financial return. Today, that relationship has changed in a deep and quiet way. The college degree has stopped being a differentiator and has become, in many sectors, a minimum requirement just to avoid exclusion from the job market. It no longer guarantees advantage, it merely prevents disadvantage. Millions of young people spend 4 or more years in college, accumulate significant debt, and graduate only to find themselves competing for jobs that pay modest wages and offer little security. This phenomenon is not accidental. It is directly linked to the mass expansion of higher education without a proportional growth in well-paid, highly qualified jobs. In the 1970s, the industrial and corporate economy absorbed graduates relatively easily. Today, the economy is more fragmented, automated, and concentrated, limiting the number of positions that truly offer high financial returns. In addition, in the 1970s, the relationship between degree cost and starting salary was extremely favorable to students. Even average careers allowed graduates to repay education costs within a few years of work. Today, in many cases, the time needed to pay off a degree exceeds a decade, or two. Higher education becomes a long-term gamble filled with uncertainty. Another crucial point is that, in the 1970s, it was possible to build a stable life without a college degree. Good industrial jobs, strong unions, and decent wages allowed non-graduates to buy homes, support families, and retire securely. A degree expanded opportunities, but it was not the only path to a dignified life. Today, that alternative has largely disappeared. Jobs that once offered stability have been automated, outsourced, or precarized. As a result, modern young people feel pressured to attend college not because they want to, but because they see no viable alternative. The degree stops being a strategic choice and becomes a defensive obligation. This shift completely changes the meaning of higher education. In the 1970s, studying was a move forward. Today, for many, it is merely an attempt not to fall behind. And that changes everything: how majors are chosen, how students relate to learning, and the frustration that follows when the promised return fails to materialize. At the same time, today's job market has become more demanding and less forgiving. Unpaid or poorly paid internships, requirements for prior experience in entry-level roles, and temporary contracts have replaced many of the entry opportunities that existed decades ago. The graduate of the 1970s was trained inside the company. Today's graduate is expected to arrive already experienced. This reality creates a cruel contradiction: the more people have degrees, the less each degree is worth individually, yet it becomes indispensable for competition. It is a race in which everyone must run faster just to stay in the same place. The financial return of a degree has therefore become highly unequal. Some fields still offer excellent returns: technology, medicine, specialized engineering, high-level finance. But even in these fields, entry costs are high and the path is long. For many other degrees, the return is uncertain or clearly insufficient to justify the debt incurred. In the 1970s, choosing a major mattered, but it rarely determined absolute financial success or failure. Today, choosing wrong can mean years of economic hardship, even with a diploma in hand. The risk has been almost entirely transferred to the individual, while educational institutions continue charging high prices regardless of student outcomes. This logic further reinforces existing inequalities. Students from wealthy families can take risks, change majors, pursue graduate degrees, or accept low-paying entry jobs as long-term investments. Indebted students have no such flexibility. They must take whatever work is available, often outside their field, just to pay bills and loans. When comparing the U.S. of the 1970s with today, it becomes clear that the degree has lost much of its transformative power. It still matters, but it is no longer a guarantee. What was once a relatively safe bridge to stability has become a narrow, expensive, and trap-filled path. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question is this: if the degree is increasingly mandatory and increasingly unrewarding, who is actually winning in this model? When we connect this with everything discussed earlier, unequal public schools, expensive universities, and growing debt, a troubling picture emerges. Education, long sold as the ultimate solution, now carries a burden it cannot bear alone. The problem is not only access, but the implicit promise of return that no longer holds for everyone. The final result is a generation more educated than ever, yet also more indebted, more insecure, and more skeptical of the system itself. Comparing past and present is not about claiming the 1970s were perfect. It is about recognizing that, in that era, educational effort had a fairer relationship with reward. Today, that relationship has broken. And as long as the degree continues to be treated as the only way out, without proportional returns from the labor market, higher education will remain, for many, less a gateway to opportunity and more a mandatory toll just to try to survive economically. If this made you rethink everything you were promised about education and the future, I want to hear your opinion. Do you believe a college degree is still worth the price being charged today? Leave your comment below. This conversation cannot stay silent. And if you want to keep understanding what has really changed between the past and the present, subscribe to the channel. The next videos will go even deeper into what almost no one explains.